Welcome to the fourth in this semester's lectures of the Princeton Adult School's N.B. Shepherd Lecture Series. I'm Dr. Mark Brannon. I'm a member of the board, and I want to welcome all of you here, and thank you for coming on good days and weather and bad days and weather. A couple of weeks ago we had a lot of snow and ice, and today, of course, there was some bad financial news in the markets. The Dow went down, what, 400 and some points, and so you're still here. So thanks for coming on good days and bad. Before I actually introduce tonight's speaker, I want to thank all of you as audience participants, and I really mean this, both for myself and for the board of the Princeton Adult School. You are the reason that this lecture series has been so successful over so many semesters and so many years. We've spent a lot of time trying to come up with topics that we thought would appeal to a large segment of the population, and clearly, I think by your numbers, we've been successful. But the series has really been successful because of your attention and of your excellent questions that you've had for our lectures. So sincerely, we want to thank you. We thank you for having come in previous semesters, and we hope you continue to come in future semesters. I also want to take a moment because this is going to be my last time that I'll be doing introductions for this semester. And so I have the microphone for a minute. I'm going to thank Nancy Beck, and she doesn't know this, but Nancy is the president of the Princeton Adult School, and she's sitting up there in the second to last row. Nancy has been, for more than 10 years, the president of the Princeton Adult School. And I really want to thank her for her leadership and for the time, it's an incredible amount of time that she has given to this organization, for her skills in organizing all of us, and for her encouragement to branch out into other fields. Now, all of you obviously have come here for this semester, and you know that you've spent $85, I believe, for the course. And you might have a question as to, well, what do we get for that $85? Obviously, you get the high caliber of this type of a series. But Nancy has been very crucial in expanding one of the things which I didn't even know about until I became a member of the board 3 years ago, and that is a charitable or scholarship fund for people who've come to our area and have enrolled in our ESOL, English for Speakers of Other Languages. And so some of the monies that you have helped have gone directly in helping these new immigrants to our area, people who are too old to enroll in high school classes and oftentimes don't have enough funds themselves to pay for ESOL classes. So you really are doing a lot of good. We need your financial support, and I might say that if you leave here tonight with a charitable thought in your mind, remember us, because we are a charitable organization, and we can always benefit from your charity for us. It helps many programs. Nancy has been very importantly involved with that program and with many others. You probably know this, but just as a few other programs that the Princeton Adult School does include courses in sign language, and for those of us who do speak at least a little bit of English, if you want to learn conversational subjects, I double-checked in our brochure, and we currently have 8 foreign languages that are being offered, ranging from Arabic to Chinese, French, German, Italian, Japanese, Russian, and Spanish. So we really are offering a lot of different things in the language arts area. The Princeton Adult School, again through Nancy's help and coordination, has taught courses as diverse as computer software program, and even we now are teaching one program for computers taught in Spanish. Other courses such as digital photography, bike repair, dog obedience, always a very heavily signed up for course. There are many cooking courses that are offered, and they usually are full too. And even ballroom dancing with your partner. Like my wife got me to do for 3 semesters in a row, but I'm not sure I have anything more than 2 left feet still. But anyway, it's a lot of fun. A lot of different things you can do besides the lectures. So thank you for being part of the Princeton Adult School. And if any of you happen to want to give back to the adult school and to the community much of your time, we are always looking for the potential for new board members. I happen to be going to be the chairman of next year's nominating committee, so you can talk to me after the lecture today or before the other lectures for the rest of the semester. Well, Nancy Beck has been our leader. She's been tireless in the work that she's done. And I wanted to thank her especially tonight because just last week she told some of us on the board that she plans to step down after more than 10 years as being president of the Princeton Adult School. We're very fortunate that her very large shoes are going to be capably filled by Barbara Lee, who's sitting right next to Nancy. Barbara is the immediate past dean of the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations, and we were very fortunate to have Barbara willing to step in. But I want to also let you know that Nancy has agreed to continue on as the curriculum coordinator. So we hope that next semester and semesters to come that these courses will still be available for all of us. Now, Nancy, I am going to ask you to stand up for just a second so we can all thank you for all the work you've done. So let's go on to the business at hand. For those of you who've been able to come for the last 3 weeks, you've heard wonderful lectures on cities as diverse as Istanbul, Rome, and Shanghai. Tonight, I'm sure you're going to have another wonderful lecture about Buenos Aires. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jeremy Edelman tonight to you. He is the Walter Samuel Carpenter III Professor in Spanish Civilization and Culture. He is also a professor of history and currently chair of the Department of History here at Princeton University. I was fortunate to audit 2 years ago Professor Edelman's course called Modern Latin America since 1810, and I know him to be an excellent lecturer. He hails from Canada, and he graduated from the University of Toronto and then moved to England, where in 1985 he received his master's degree in economic history at the London School of Economics. 4 years later, he completed his doctorate in modern history at Oxford University. For many years now, he's been on the faculty at Princeton University, and for many years, he has been the director of Princeton's program in Latin American Studies. 3 years ago, he was chosen and received the President's Award for Distinguished Teaching, a very coveted award indeed. Just last week, President Tillman named a committee to advise her on international opportunities and challenges and asked Jeremy Edelman to co-chair this committee. So there's more work in the future for you. Professor Edelman has received multiple different awards, including the Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship and the ACLS Frederick Burkhardt Fellowship. I think that stands for the American Council of Learned Societies. He has written many books and articles, as well as editing others, mainly on Latin America and especially in Argentina. A previous book he wrote is very pertinent for tonight's lecture. It's called Republic of Capital, Buenos Aires, and the Legal Transformation of the New World, which won the American Historical Association's Atlantic History Prize. Tonight, he will tell us all about Buenos Aires and the political theater of modern Argentina. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jeremy Edelman.
Okay, how's that working for microphone? that okay? Okay. Thank you, Mark. Thanks, everybody, for turning out. I didn't know about Dow. I don't care. I have to worry about my committees. I have some slides to show, and I will talk to you about a century of history leading up to the present of Argentine history, focusing on Buenos Aires. But I should say, by way of introduction, that I spent a number of years living in Buenos Aires. I moved there in late '86 and was there. That was my home base while I moved around between England and Argentina until I came here in 1992. And it was a very convulsive period in Argentine history on the heels of a long, very brutal dictatorship, which I will get to at the end of the lecture. But it was also a moment of great hope. And Argentina is still living in the shadow of that moment. Aspirations to create a meaningful democracy, but also concerns about how to address a very traumatic recent past. I'll get to that point in the end of the lecture. But one of the arguments I want to make is that that conjuncture, the one that we continue to inhabit today, is the product of a set of processes that were set in motion a century ago. So while there have been a lot of very striking changes in more recent Argentine history, there have been a lot of underlying continuities across the past century. So I want to talk about political turbulence, and I want to talk about its urban theater, where the drama unfolds. Why an urban theater? Well, as you're going to see, so much of the political life, of Republican life in Argentina transpired with great upheavals and great efforts at consensus making in the streets of Buenos Aires, in the plazas of Buenos Aires. It was the capital of a republic, and in this capital acquired a very distinctive political culture in which the streets and the streetscapes would be the setting for very dramatic political history. So that the politics of social change unfolded in these very, very public spaces. And that will mark the nature of Argentine dictatorships and democracies. Let me start with a poem. Jorge Luis Borges, whom I'm very happy to remind you in case you don't know, is the author of a quote on the side of Princeton's library. I'm going to read you a poem of one of his about Buenos Aires. It's called "The Streets." My soul is in the streets of Buenos Aires, not the greedy streets jostling with crowds and traffic, but the neighborhood streets where nothing is happening, almost invisible by force of habit, rendered eternal in the dim light of sunset, and the ones even farther out, empty of comforting trees, where austere little houses scarcely venture, overwhelmed by deathless distances, losing themselves in the deep expanse of sky and plains. I'll get to those also in just a minute. For the solitary one, they are a promise, because thousands of singular souls inhabit them, unique before God and in time, and no doubt precious. To the west, the north, and the south unfold the streets, and they too are my country. Within these lines I trace, may their flags fly. And in this poem, he encapsulates much of the drama of the city. Lyrical, almost pastoral image of a city, evoking, in a sense, an urban topography with very particular physical features, it's worth saying, in the image of the deathless distance of a city and its solitude and lines that radiate out to a frontier that disappears in the horizon. Why this image? Why did Borges choose this image. Well, Buenos Aires is the gateway to the Republic. If you arrived from Europe, as millions and millions did in the late 19th and early 20th century, you would arrive at Buenos Aires, very much as you would have arrived at New York City. And you would have stepped ashore onto the streets of the capital of the Republic, and it would have given way to the plains known in Spanish as the Pampas. That's what Borges is referring to when he speaks of the treeless plains. So, it's a city that at one faces the River Plate, and from the River Plate onto the Atlantic, and from the Atlantic onto Europe, to Africa, and the rest of the Americas. And it's back, in a sense, to the Pampas and the plains, and beyond the plains to the Andes. The city was an entrepot, a gateway between the worlds that it connected. Let me just make sure that this works. Aha. Wow. Or, yes, Mark is breathing a sigh of relief here. This is the city in the late 19th century. A port city at its very beginning as it's being constructed. You can see it's a ramshackle place on the shores of the River Plate, a gigantic, a very wide river. You can't see the other side of it. And it will soon emerge into the busiest port in the Americas. Now, the fact that it's a port city matters a lot. Like so many ports, it has a particular feverish quality to it of commerce, of hustle and bustle, of trade, of minglings of peoples from different parts of the world. And there would be one neighborhood in particular that would, in a sense, crystallize, bring together these features of the port, called La Boca, the mouth of a smaller river that gives on to the River Plate. And this is that bridge that's built over the small river. That's what the mouth refers to. And it became the epicenter of the commercial life of the city, and around which the capital of the Republic would be built. This neighborhood of La Boca is going to be very important for the story we're going to talk about this evening. But behind the city, of course, lies the Pampas, the plains, the roads that radiate outwards, and not just the roads, but the railroads, like Chicago, would radiate outwards to the plains, to the Pampas, in a sense, the most fertile lands of the world. So behind the city would be in this case, it's the settlers and the marketers bringing their commodities to market in the city from the plains, so that Buenos Aires serves as, in a sense, the central node, the uniter of the Republic, connecting it to other regions of the Republic and to other parts of the world. And it was as the epicenter, the clearinghouse, the entrepot, that Buenos Aires would move very quickly from being a dusty outpost of a very chaotic republic in the middle of the 19th century to, and in a sense, a city that very few would have predicted would become one of the world's great urban metropolises, to become, by 1914, the second largest city in the New World after New York, with a population of about 2 million people. So the city looks like a hub with spokes radiating out of it towards the rims of the Republic, with commodities flowing in from the Andes and the plains to move through the port onwards for consumption by the rest of the world. Argentina would become the world's greatest exporter of, well, most notoriously, of course, beef. And now that the ban on Argentine beef exports to the United States has been lifted, you can go eat on the Upper West Side at a very good restaurant called La Pampa and eat real steak, not the bogus stuff that Americans call steak. So this stuff would flow out through Buenos Aires, and by the same token, commodities would move in. Capital would move in. Immigrants would flow through the port to Buenos Aires and through it to the rest of the Republic. The world came to Buenos Aires. 4.5 million migrants would move to the city between 1870 and 1930 and would change the social landscape of Argentina, and especially Buenos Aires. The majority of the population of Buenos Aires in 1914 did not have Spanish as its mother tongue. It was by far the most ethnically diverse city in the Americas. But it was not just immigrants that moved in, images moved in. It was an aesthetic capital as well, particularly for European influence. And in many respects, Buenos Aires would begin to look, as it developed very precociously, like a European metropolis. I'll give you a few examples of the architecture. These are the buildings being put up along one of the central axes, the Avenida de Mayo, that runs down like an axis from the middle of the city. This is Calle Florida, peatonal, a walking street where all of the great shoppers of the fin de siècle would go, and where, it's worth adding, the only other Harrods would be located out of London. Here too, the center of the city, electrified, beautiful, European. And just to make sure that there was no ambiguity about its European features, we have to have the obligatory obelisk right in the middle of the Avenida de 9 de Julio, which Argentines are very proud to remind you, and I don't know whether it's true or not, is the widest avenue in the world. So Buenos Aires would go again from being a dusty outpost to very much looking like a European capital. It would also be a place for which the refinements of Europe would be enjoyed, particularly by Argentine elites. This is the tea house of El Jockey Club. If you go to Buenos Aires today, you can actually go there. Some of the very best equestrian skills and horses are Argentine. Polo is a sport still played by the Argentine upper crust. And there is a fabulous, fabulous hippodromo racetrack you must absolutely visit. But the Jockey Club was the place to which the members of the Argentine social elite would congregate and talk about business of the day. So it was a great city if you belonged to the upper crust. But not everybody was a have. There were lots in this city, in this capital of a republic, lots of have-nots who did not entirely feel like they belonged to the same republic. Many enjoyed a better life in Buenos Aires than they would in Europe, and for this reason they would move there, but it did not make it an easy life. Nor, by the same token, for those who moved from the interior, particularly from the more impoverished provinces of the Andes and the Argentine Northwest, to the city looking for opportunities, it did not necessarily mean that they found them. So while the salons and the cafes for the upper crust would be thriving, there would be a restaurant business that would thrive as well for the plebeian and common folk of the city that would also, in a sense, spread along the arteries, along the streets that Borges describes in his poem. But it was a tough life for many people, a tough life that some of you may most be familiar with, exemplified by the Argentine national music of the tango, which is a melancholic, mournful, national music, in a sense nostalgic for lost times, dashed opportunities, and dismal hopes. Tango was, in a sense, the musical expression of a social experience of the republic that was not a republic for everybody. Indeed, there were a lot of have-nots. Lots of problems, as with any port city that would grow so quickly, that would accept so many people so fast, particularly shortages of housing. People living in squalor, in what we would now call shanty towns, living in boarding houses in the center of the city. And indeed, by 1907, in the middle of the golden age of Argentine development, you would begin to have mass protests and demonstrations in favor of improved living conditions. In 1907, a very famous strike by tenants. This is the photograph of, that I found in the archives of families who have occupied occupying the houses and boarding quarters that they live in and refusing to pay their rent. And there was a widespread strike across the city against landlords. It was only part of a set of agitations fueled by the advent of yet more European influences, socialism, anarchism, syndicalism, all of which would combine to motivate popular contestation and demands claims that they too, these people, the have-nots, belonged to the Republic. And these European influences would help galvanize popular movements demanding incorporation, membership, and rights that would flow from that. Huge upheavals, soon sweeping across, yes, its epicenter, La Boca, the mouth of the River Plate, where so many European migrants had first landed, right? And of course, by virtue of their first landing, would often find the first place to live. La Boca was the port, and the neighborhoods around it were the epicenter of a lot of this ferment. And it would culminate in a wave of strikes in the fateful year of 1919. Strikes that crisscrossed all kinds of lines, ideological, socialism, and early expressions of communism against bosses, demands that the state enforce some of the laws that existed on the books to protect tenants, child workers, and many other stipulations. And in this showdown, too, would emerge a clash of two rival images of a republic, right? Of the immigrant working classes demanding rights from the state that would be enforceable by the state versus a nativist movement, a nationalist movement that would react to this agitation with the first signs of right-wing nativist movements suppressing these kinds of activities. In one very famous episode in January 1919, known as Semana Santa, right-wing goon squads would patrol, this is the shores of La Boca, the streets to break up meetings in the saloons, the trade union houses, and to force people back to work, particularly targeting the people whom these right-wing nativist squads believed to be responsible for the agitation, Jewish Bolsheviks. And here you have what was known as the Liga Patriótica, the Patriotic League, chasing down some workers and breaking up a union meeting. What came out of that high water mark of popular agitation was, in a sense, the suppression of a set of claims that had been brewing up for several decades for incorporation, membership, and rights to be respected. That was then suppressed, contained for the moment. But the question would remain, how would the have-nots relate to the republic that now was explicitly defined for others. Now, the 1920s was, in a sense, the last decade of the golden age of this era of Buenos Aires as the entrepot. It was a decade of stability, of prosperity, and the streets, right, were restored to their gentric cultures, and Buenos Aires resumed its course as a city, in a sense, built in the image of its elites. There was also the growth of a very vibrant, cultured middle class. Nonetheless, there were important intractable problems, that the divides between the haves and the have-nots did not go away just because these were good times. The crack would come in the 1930s. The Great Depression, as in so many other corners of the Atlantic world, would break up the systems that people had become accustomed to, systems that people were accustomed to, but by the Great Depression were clearly unable to cope with the mounting pressures of the economic collapse. The old model of commodities flowing into Buenos Aires, commodities flowing out of Buenos Aires, immigrants coming in, the notion that the prosperity would be premised on Buenos Aires' participation in an international division of labor was eviscerated. There were, nonetheless, in the 1930s, illusions of splendor still to be had, particularly for the elites. But the failure of the model revealed itself to the masses. Now, with unemployment spreading, the agitation that was once suppressed in 1919 now spilled back into the streets and the plazas of the capital of the Republic. And in many ways, this process of a resurgent agitation started with the unfinished legacies of 1919. For while the repression in the port city and in the streets of Buenos Aires was going on in a small town in the Pampas, in the shadow of Buenos Aires, a town called Los Toldos, a girl was born, Eva Duarte, in 1919. Born of a humble background, at 15 years of age, she moved to the capital, to Buenos Aires, to seek fortune and possibly fame. Like so many other migrants from the interior and from the plains seeking opportunities, she was captivated by the image of a city now that was dripping with opportunities for ambitious folk like her. And she would rise up to become a popular radio soap star. Here's an early photograph of her. I can already hear the reactions. She is very beautiful. This is Evita Perón. And in a fateful convergence in 1944, she would meet a very charismatic officer in the Argentine army, a man called Colonel Juan Domingo Perón, also from the provinces, who would join the army and rise up through its ranks to become the most important statesman in Argentine history. Let's roll back a little bit. The 1930s is often called in Argentina the infamous decade, la década infame, because it denotes a problem that the Republic had, that there were changes afoot. The country was adjusting. Its old agrarian base was declining, but there was a new model of economic development based on industries and manufacturing that was beginning to emerge. The working class had gone from being dominated by immigrants now to first-generation born Argentines. New media, like the radio, would connect people up. And, of course, shifts in popular culture. The tango would go from being a music that was proscribed, illegal in the saloons in the port, now to becoming almost the official culture, but still bearing its plebeian hallmarks. And yet, for all these changes, the politics of Buenos Aires had ossified. The country was being held together politically by a combination of fraud and corruption. This was its unsustainable combination. And it was these underlying changes that would soon crack open the state in the form of a crisis, as the Second World War did in so many places of the world, the downfall of the old republic. In 1943, in a very convulsive year in Argentina, with a political stalemate and the fear that the country could not overcome its political stagnation, the military stepped in. It was not the first time the military had stepped in to meddle in Argentine political affairs, but it was a very dramatic coup d'etat because now, for the first time, the military declared, as it took over the government, that it would help create a new order. It would break the political logjam. And, moreover, this order would repudiate some of the exclusionary features of the early republic and build something new, premised on inclusion. The idea that the military had was a hybrid combination of British laborist influences, Italian corporatism, an amalgam that people only later on grew to call a form of Argentine fascism. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. But the idea here was that we had to find an alternative solution that would both integrate the masses into the political life of the country while not destabilizing it. This was the challenge. And who better to do this than the military? They, after all, are paid to preserve stability. The broker of this regime was Colonel Perón. Perón soon emerged as the most powerful figure in the military junta, and he used in particular one ministry, the Ministry of Labor, to develop and nurture a new alliance, a new recombination of the power of the military with the power of the popular masses, using the Ministry of Labor to dole out the kinds of rights that had been suppressed since 1919. But it was these very concessions that forced the old elites, who were still disgruntled at having been dislodged from power in 1943, to react and to put pressure on other members of the military to throw Perón out of office. By this time, he'd risen up to become vice president of the republic. And it worked. The old elites, pressure on the military, there was a lot of negotiation and infighting within the military. If there are any military folks in the audience, you will know that militaries are not simple organizations. Right? Lots of infighting going on, and but the elites, having played their hand, in a sense, played it for in a sense, for the last time, because the response was completely unanticipated. So much had changed between the coup of June 1943 and the time that Perón was arrested on the 2nd of October 1945. In just a few short years, the Republic had already changed very quickly. The trade unions were able to mass the working classes of Buenos Aires to rise up in a groundswell of popular outrage because they saw Perón now arrested by the military itself and sent off to a small island in the middle of the River Plate called Martin Garcia. They saw Perón as their benefactor, right? And were afraid that the restoration of the old republic would deprive them of the rights that they'd acquired in the previous 2 very fervent years. And on the 17th of October, 1945, this is the birthday of modern Peronism, the streets and the plazas of the city were overtaken by the masses. This is the center of Buenos Aires on the 17th of October, 1945. It'll give you a sense of what was happening in the streets of the capital of the Republic. Here was the occupation of the genteel, upper-class, Europeanized city of the Republic, now turned over to the masses. You can't see it there because it's all clogged up. But there's a fountain in the middle, and in the middle of the fountain where the children of the upper class would go on Sundays to feed the pigeons. The people in mocking the elite Sunday outings stripped into their underwear and danced in the fountain. A very famous image of popular occupation of otherwise hitherto excluded spaces. 17th of October, 1945. So crowded that the workers had to climb up on lampposts to get a view. And they occupied the city and demanded that the military release Perón from prison. There is a story that is told, it is apocryphal, but I'll tell it to you anyway because it's a good story, that Evita, in the meantime, along with the trade union leaders of the country, was driving around the neighborhoods of Buenos Aires, the neighborhoods that Borges refers to. Borges hated Evita. I'll get to that in a minute. Would drive around the neighborhoods with altoparlantes, convoking the people to this mass demonstration and the occupation of the city. It was a shock to the system. The politics of the streets had so suddenly changed. And a new order was coming into being. Fearing what any elite would fear when the city is taken over like this, the military agreed quickly to release Perón from prison. Perón, I'm digressing a little bit, but Perón actually wasn't sure he wanted off the island of Martín Garcia. This was kind of scary for him. He had no intention of doing this. This was when I meant that the elite played its hand and created all kinds of unanticipated consequences. It was not that Perón had any idea that this would happen either. But his advisors said, you better get off this island and come and address the masses. And he did. The military agreed quickly that they would cobble together elections in February 1946, elections at which, and again, we could talk about these fateful elections because the American ambassador could not resist the temptation to get involved and screw things up. But Perón triumphed. It was a very narrow margin of victory. He won and declared and announced, for good reason, that there was a new force that would dominate the public stage and the streetscapes of Buenos Aires. And he would set about trying to consolidate a new order. And in the process of consolidating his new order, he would rely on one of his most important political assets, his wife, Evita, now rebaptized politically from Eva Duarte, the soap opera star, to Evita Perón. They got married. The wife of El General, the president. What emerged from Evita's activities was she presented herself as the herald of the descamisados, the shirtless ones, the people who had to work in their undershirts and who didn't have collars and buttons. And she was, more than any other figure in the Peronist alliance, responsible for mobilizing people into the streets. This is the election in February 1946. Right? And she was the public figure of this new idea of a republic for those who did not have under the old regime. And she was an artful user of the presidential palace's balcony that overlooked the giant square, the Plaza de Mayo, where the masses would congregate, where she would speechify. And as the government consolidated its hold, in a sense, would become more virulent. This is a very famous photograph used by, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A if you want, the Montoneros, who would emerge as the most important left-wing insurgency movement in the 1970s. Their icon was of Evita. Evita, the rebel against traditional authority. And so she would use the streetscapes, right, and address publicly the peoples of the city to try to integrate and consolidate a new order. This was charisma at work, and deployed the power to mobilize in the service of a new model of citizenship, even extending it to women. Here's an image of her on one of the balconies reaching out to her followers and using these kinds of public spaces accordingly. And it was not just the balcony that she would use. Here you will see, Perón cumple, evita dignifica. I don't know if I can use this thing. Just press this button, right? Yeah. You can read that. Perón cumple, evita dignifica. Perón delivers, evita dignifies. My version. This is the interior of the Teatro Colón, Argentina's opera house, which was a 3/4 replica of the Paris Opera House, which had been bombed in 1908 by a Jewish anarchist. And that was one of the reasons why there was an anti-Semitic groundswell among nativists in Argentina. If you go to Buenos Aires now, unfortunately, the Teatro Colón is closed and being restored. It's a beautiful opera house. Here, appalling the elites, turning it over to the feminist branch of the Peronist party. So occupying all of the traditional elite spaces of the capital. So much so that the Perons would dress themselves up practically as new monarchs, and yet using the public appeal of glamour. But mobilization on this scale soon led to polarization. With the sudden insertion of the have-nots into the public life of the country, the traditional haves, of course, felt now squashed, sidelined, and marginalized. And the republic grew increasingly divided and polarized between old elites, the opposition parties, and even some disenchanted members of the old Peronist coalition on the one hand, right, and the Peronist movement on the other. One of the emblems of this opposition coalition was, of course, Borges himself, the blind poet, director of the National Library in Buenos Aires, who was sacked quickly by Perón and ordered to serve as a chicken factory inspector. This was seen as the height of the disdain that Peronists had for elite culture in Argentina. The division between these two loose coalitions became open in 1952. The galvanizing force behind this polarization and of the two republics was Evita's own aspirations to become vice president herself. She argued that she should be, in the elections of 52, she should stand as the vice presidential candidate beside her husband. And there was a lot of reaction. People, because she was such a catalytic agent for the Peronist movement, she was also seen as a devil by the opposition. And pressure was put to bear on Perón and his supporters and his closest advisors. Do not let this woman run or you will face a coup d'etat. And Perón faced the difficult challenge of having to talk his ambitious wife into not being his running mate. And in a very famous speech that she gives, here's an image of the fighting, Evita fighting for the people against bosses. But in a very famous image, a very famous speech that she gives on the balcony of the Casa Rosada, the presidential palace, to the people, she explains that fate has decided that she cannot run as the vice president of the Republic. And she turns around and she embraces Juan and cries on his shoulder. In fact, the Peronist coalition was crumbling from within. It was unable to hold its component parts together. So not only was the country polarizing, but the Peronist coalition was imploding. The metaphor, in fact, was Evita herself, who was, and the real reason she didn't run as the vice presidential candidate, was that she had been diagnosed in 1951 of suffering from uterine cancer. So by the time the election campaign began, she herself was already feeling the effects of her disease. But she fought till the end, cast her vote as she was dying in the elections of 1952. And when she did die on the 26th of July of that year, at the age of 33, as Peronists will remind you, the same age as Jesus Christ, she became the martyr for one model of the Republic, right? The Republic for the have-nots. The funeral also speaks to the use of the streetscape. Here's the cortege. As her body would wind its way through the center of the street, where the streetscapes would be used for public mourning, but also, in a sense, emblematic of the dying age of a set of aspirations that people would have for Peronism. So that's making its way through the center of the city. From, you can see in the background, the Congress building, Argentine Congress building, making its way to the National Cathedral, which is the that 1820s with the Doric columns there, and the grieving that her followers shared now in the middle of the streets, the capital of the Republic. But this martyred saint for the Peronist masses was also a slut. She was la puta, she was known as, bringing down all that had been good and virtuous about the old order, and was the source of fury for the anti-Peronist coalitions. And so gradually, two republics would war in the streets of Buenos Aires over the soul of the republic. Coup d'etats, 1955, 1962, 1966, 1976, each coup d'etat more bloody than the other. What was consistent were three things. One is that at each year passing, what marked the politics of the Republic was its increasing polarization. That whatever middle ground had existed once upon a time now was increasingly impossible to hold. Secondly, that the politics of the city was in a stalemate. No one could govern, but each side had enough power to neutralize the efforts of others. And thirdly, that the politics was increasingly militarized. By 1973, the Republic was tearing itself apart in the form of an urban civil war, with the right wing and the left wing of the Peronist movement itself at war. The last salvation came in the form of Perón's return. He'd been ousted in 1955, made his peregrination through various despotic governments around the world where despots like to go hide out, and winds up in Spain under Generalissimo Franco. Along the way in Panama, he picked up a nightclub dancer named Isabelita, which if you've been reading the papers these days, you will know that she is now being charged for human rights abuses. The last gasp is to invite Perón to return. He's the only person who can preserve order. Even the anti-Peronists themselves, desperate for a solution, bring him back. But Perón's return from exile was a catastrophe. Even on the day that he was to land at the international airport of Ezeiza on the outskirts of Buenos Aires, the masses found out about the day that he was to arrive, and they went to greet him. 2 million people converged on the airport. And hours before the plane was to arrive, the right-wing factions of the Peronist coalition and the left-wing faction of the Peronist coalitions began to fire on each other. Perón himself learns when he's flying, the plane is to arrive in Buenos Aires, and the pilot relays the news. I mean, we can't land in the airport. They're shooting at each other. And so they have to redirect the plane to one of the other airports in Buenos Aires. But this, too, was emblematic of the decay unto which the Republic and the city had crumbled. This was the end of an illusion that any savior could deliver the Republic from its own impasse. Anyone but the military. And in 1976, March 24th, 1976, the military once more came to power. And it stepped in with a very different aspiration in mind. This time they did so for good. Very different from the previous coups d'etats. Most coups d'etats in the long, sorry history of coups d'etats in Latin America, most of them until the 1970s would take over power, but very temporarily, to throw at the bad guy, clean the slate, prepare the way for the good guy, whoever that was going to be. They were all guys, and they were all supposed to be the good guys, right? This time things were different. Now the military was saying, we're going to stay in power. We are going to reorganize society from top to bottom and bottom to top. And they called their regime the process of national reorganization, and they were not going to step down until they were done. Pinochet had the very same idea. And they perpetrated, in the name of restructuring an entire society, perpetrated a brutality and level of atrocity of an utterly unprecedented kind. And in the name of civilization, they would inflict such barbarities. 30,000 people disappeared, many, many, many more exiled. The targets and the spaces all spoke to the streetscapes of Buenos Aires. A metaphor and a reality of the kind of repression that the military perpetrated was the unmarked Ford Falcon. The car of the quintessential car used by the squads of the military to round up people that they found suspicious. Unmarked, and since they didn't have plates on them, so nobody could actually figure out who these people were, although everybody knew who they were. The city was turned inside out. As the streets were emaciated of the politics that had been so vibrant for so many decades, right? The job of cleansing the Republic now went and moved behind closed doors. Where did the Ford Falcons go? I'm going to end on a few slides. They went here. This is the Naval Mechanics School. It is the most notorious torture chamber in Argentina, called ESMA. It's not the biggest. The Campo de Mayo probably saw more victims, but this was the most infamous. It was run by the Navy, by one man, Admiral Maceda, who really tried to use the torture center as a place for which he could learn more about the urban insurgent movement, of particularly the Montoneros. And we know that about 5,000 people were rounded up and processed through the Naval Mechanics School, approximately 500 survivors. What happened to the rest? 4,500 people moving through Argentina's detention center. Well, they were tortured here. It's now been sanitized. They were tortured here, often for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then after they were useful, and their use was finished, they would be put on vans in the middle of the night, driven out to the airfield near the Naval Mechanics School, and tied up, put on airplanes in the middle of the night, flying over the Atlantic, and they would be thrown overboard. This was the favorite means of disappearing people, and it was out of this that the whole notion, the word to disappear somebody, would be coined. But Maceda wanted something else. He wanted to document what he was doing. After all, he was torturing people for a reason. Kept data, testimonies, information, photographs of the insurgents. She looks really dangerous to me. These are photographs that were taken just before the victims would be subjected to torture. She was disappeared. She was disappeared. He was disappeared. He was disappeared too. This is an interesting photograph. This is the brother of the photographer. The photographer was also himself detained. As we know now increasingly from the way torture chambers often function is that they needed also victims themselves to be involved in the process of extracting information. And so his brother takes the photograph. The question is, how did these photographs get out? Because when the military regime finally collapsed in 1983, they sanitized everything. But one thing the photographer did, because he was seen as a valuable asset to the military in the extraction of information, is they would let him go home at night. He was tortured during the day or forced to take photographs because he was a photographer of the victims of torture, but then they would release him to go walk the streets of Buenos Aires till he could get home and come back the next day and go to work. And he realizes that in this strange state that he has to live in, that he can smuggle out the negatives while he's at it. This is how we know so much about what happened in this detention center. Even nightmares end. In 1982, we can talk about this in the Q&A, the system cracked. The war in the Malvinas, an economic collapse, and pretty soon people began to retake the streets as the regime began to crumble. Led, above all, the icon of the new opposition movement to the regime was the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, who called for the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo because where did they go? They went to the very same Plaza de Mayo, the central square in front of the presidential palace, to protest to the military to demand that their disappeared children be accounted for, the mothers of the disappeared. And they retook the streets from the military. And therein began a long transition to democracy, a transition that we are still in the midst of. It's an unfinished process of elections, yes, but also trying to reconcile what to do with the memories of this. It just happened. ESMA, the Naval Mechanics School, last November was taken away from the Navy and handed over to the government. A very good friend of mine is the director of what will soon become the Museum to the Memory of the Dictatorship. Buenos Aires, then, is a city of civilization, but also a city of barbarism. Buenos Aires is a city of mobilization, but it's also a city of repression. Buenos Aires is a city of hopes and aspirations, but also a city of fears and ghosts. Buenos Aires is also a city of homes and the capital of a country. I want to read for you again the last 4 lines of Borges' famous poem. To the west, to the north, and the south unfold the streets, and they too are my country. Within these lines I trace, may their flags fly. Thank you very much. Sure, we have time. How much time do we have?
10 minutes or so?
10 minutes or so. Questions? Yeah. Compare it to the Pinochet regime? Well, there are a lot of similarities, obviously. They were part of a whole series of coups d'etats. Uruguay's in 1973. The 70s was a pretty dark decade in Latin America. By 1979, there were really only 3 functioning democracies. Some of them were barely functioning democracies left in Latin America, and that was Venezuela, Costa Rica, and Colombia. Otherwise, it's a sea of dictators. And so in many respects, they bore similar hallmarks. That is, these were regimes that were contrived to solve an underlying social and political problem. Militaries do not step out of the barracks because they like to in Latin America. They are because there are social constituencies who want them to come out and create a particular social order to solve underlying problems. The idea was to stop agitation, instability, the prospects of communism. They were strongly marked by the Cold War, and to suppress what were seen to be the agents of subversion. That was the language used at the time. The difference was, of course, that the Argentine military was stepping in to solve a riddle of what was becoming a civil war. Pinochet stepped in a very different context. He overthrew a constitutionally elected democratic regime that was, yes, a socialist regime, but that was firmly committed to the constitutional rules of the game. The same could not be said of the government that the military in Argentina toppled in 1976. The irony was, just as the regime that toppled the Argentine government in 76, in a sense, overthrew an anarchic regime that had preceded it, it too, the military government, was itself a very unstable amalgamation, very corrupt, venal, and therefore also very short-lived, built up on a temporary influx of money based on extensive foreign borrowing. Pinochet had a very different model, and of course he lasted much, much longer. And in that sense, whether you like it or not, was the architect of a new social order in Chile in a way that the Argentine military was not.
What's the relationship between the U.S. government and Argentina?
You want to know about that election in 1946, right? Nowadays, the current president of Argentina is a Peronist. His name is Kirchner from the south. And when he was first elected, actually a lot of people had hopes because you have to remember, Argentina went through about 5 years ago a terrible bout of very severe instability, about 4 presidents in a matter of weeks, a serious economic crisis. And many people actually worried that, if Argentina tanked, it would pull Brazil down with it, and with it a whole system internationally. And in the wake of that bout of instability, Kirchner won the elections, and he was very successful at cobbling together a viable coalition. And was responsible for a lot of progressive measures. The taking over the ESMA being but one, restoring some integrity to the legal process that the previous governments, under particularly Carlos Menem, had degraded. I have to say that of late, a lot of people have become concerned that his appetite for power has fed itself, and that he very softly appears to want to stay in power more than his constitutional mandate would allow. He's also part of a much broader process that has affected a lot of Latin American countries, which is what we call the pink turn. Lula in Brazil. Chavez is, of course, the most colorful, and he's not really pink, I mean, he's bright red. Ecuador, Peru, and Uruguay, Chile, and many governments now in Latin America are left of center. Very important, though, for you to know that Chavez does not represent a tide. I mean, that's where the pink turn is actually a disservice. There's a lot of difference. Lula's is a very serious government. Bachelet's government in Chile, and these are serious people with, PhDs running the government. PhDs don't necessarily make you a good minister, by the way, but very competent people. And sort of to lump them all together as part of this Hugo Chavez drift serves the ignoramuses in Washington and Hugo Chavez above all. So Kirchner, though, plays a little bit with fire. He is part of this turn. He takes advantage of, and a lot of others do, of Hugo Chavez's more inflammatory talks to actually do things locally that they might not otherwise get away with. Right now, the relations are pretty good, but not great. What Washington wants is stability, and Kirchner delivers. So, in a sense, there isn't an underlying problem.
You described a very international city
Yeah.
early in the decade. What is demographics like now?
Who's been to Buenos Aires? Don't you think everybody should go? Yeah, why not? ¿Por qué no, right? It is a bit far. It's cheap, though. The peso is very inexpensive. No, the migratory flow turned off around 1930, as it did all around the Atlantic world. There was a brief flurry of migration after the Second World War, as was typical of the Atlantic world. Spanish and Italian migrants and, of course, Nazi refugees wound up in Argentina. But for the most part, it's domestically born. It's actually it's a cosmopolitan city in the sense that Porteños, people who live in Buenos Aires, are very cosmopolitan people. But they all speak Spanish. They're all several generations Argentine. It's very hard to get Thai food. And the Chinese food really sucks. So it's not, in a sense, it's not a boiling melting pot, American or Canadian style. Whereas it once had been, it was not. It was a very curious phenomenon. In the 1980s, Argentina was very open to Russian emigres, and there's a small Russian emigre population there. But otherwise, their typical surnames are Spanish and Italian and German, but of a much earlier vintage. Yep.
And number two, you said one of the bombings was laying on Iran.
Yeah.
Today, what is happening with terrorists or the influence
Yeah.
of some of the terrorist ideas? Are they as strong as is growing in Europe?
Yep. Two good questions. On the first, the Nazis played no role. The Nazis went and hid in the south, a beautiful area around Bariloche, where they could live in their quasi-Nordic fashion in chalets and try to be forgotten. Of course, they always lived in a little fear that they would get caught, and some of them were, and we know that Eichmann, being the most famous, and was sent to Israel to face trial. But they tried to, keep cool. And there's always been, there are a couple of books about this, the Nazis in Argentina. There's a lot more made. What's the name of that movie that, it's been a legendary story about all the Nazis crawling around. And in fact, what's that? Yeah, Buenos, okay. That they wound up in Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, and if you went down, there'd be these training camps and Nazioid kind of, it's a fictive. It really wasn't like that. Some people have felt that Perón had close Nazi advisors because he did have some fascistic features to his government. But he was much more influenced by Italian, by Mussolini's corporatism than he was by Hitler's wackery. He had actually served in Italy in the early 1930s and was very impressed, as were many people, by what Mussolini had done before the Second World War. And came back thinking, well, there are elements of this fascist regime in the original denomination that we could use here. But otherwise not very influential. In terms of the bombings, there were two bombings in the early 1990s in Buenos Aires. One of the Jewish Community Center, actually right around the corner from where I lived for a while, in a very heavily Jewish, traditionally Jewish working class, the textile neighborhood of Buenos Aires, the Schmata district. And Yeah, it got leveled. I mean, this was a big building. There are about 400,000 Jews in Buenos Aires. It's one of the largest Jewish cities in the world. And that was devastating. They still don't know who did it. Yeah, and what's the paper trail? The other bombing was of just outside the Israeli embassy, which was much less devastating. It was the community center that was really the cruel one. There were families and. The government at the time, Carlos Menem, said he would have a full trial and investigation, and he never did. And one of the problems is, of course, the problem of the rule of law when you have to, do you remember my definition of the rule of law from History 304? Where the rulers and the ruled play by the same rules. That under Menem, that the security forces at the time were allowed to run their own affairs. Many of them were probably implicated in the bombing itself. Now, it's unclear whether they just had got financial kickbacks or they were trading in something. Nobody knows. But for that reason, Menem never did conduct a full-scale investigation. Kirchner says he will now do it. But we don't have really conclusive proof that there was a government behind this. Are there training camps in the borderlands, particularly around Paraguay and Brazil and Argentina, as a lot of people have suspected? After Al-Qaeda blew up the Twin Towers, a lot of people thought that there were camps there. If there were once, they do not now exist. One of the largest military bases outside in Latin America is currently being built in Paraguay on the borders between Argentina and Brazil by the U.S. military, in part for this reason. So it's not really a menace. How are we doing? One more question. Yeah?
Can you talk a bit about how fellows mobilize the masses by giving had no rights or giving power? Could you sort of talk about specifically what did they do
Yep.
the politics of theater?
Sure. It changed with time. The biggie goes back to October 17th, 1945, the birthday of Peronism. It literally is the birthday. It's a national holiday if you're a Peronist. So half the country doesn't go to work. The other half of the country, doesn't go to work happily, and the other half of the country goes to work, doesn't go to work also happily, but not for the very same reasons. The reason for the mobilization on the 17th of October 1945 was over one particular labor law that Perón had been negotiating with the trade unions as a concession. You give me your loyalty, right, when he was Minister of Labor, and I will give you the rights to the closed shop and obligatory collective bargaining systems for employers. It was that decree in September 1945 by the military government that galvanized the opposition and forced his arrest on the 2nd of October. On the 9th of October, the new Minister of Labor abrogated the decree. And it was that propelled the trade unions to agitate and take over the streets. That was one right. That had been something that the trade union, those of you who remember trade unions, I always have to, it's really weird to talk to teach 19-year-olds. Trade union is, what? It's true. They don't have a concept of this. But that had been a real cornerstone of the movements since 1919. In fact, the agitation of 1919 was very much over the closed shop. That was the first. And there were many others, including in the enfranchisement of women. So when you saw that Teatro Colón meeting, that was of the Rama Feminista, the feminist branch. It really means the feminine branch of the Partido Peronista, the Peronist Party. Its delegates meeting in the Teatro Colón to discuss whatever it was they were discussing. But the women were enfranchised, housing, all of the problems that had been explicitly laid out as the dilemmas of the have-nots were, as far as Evita and Perón were concerned, these were going to be solved by them. Yes, houses, food, public transportation, trade union rights, and in fact, it was the Beveridge report of the Labor government in Britain that had been really the most important document for the early Peronist years for social legislation.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.